Apparently, last night there was an attack in Glasgow. Well, rather not last night, but yesterday evening. I hadn't watched the news, so I wasn't aware of this. I just saw it on, internet news. Pretty serious incident. Apparently, three or four men and two boys were stabbed. This occurred in a hotel in Great George Street, I believe, in Glasgow city centre. And the perpetrator was a Sudanese national who apparently complained about food being allocated at the hotel he was in. So that's a pretty serious incident. Thankfully, no fatalities, but inevitably people will draw questions as to was this a terrorist attack or not. Strathclyde Police, or I think it's now one unit, Scotland Police, um, are not classing it as a terrorist incident. So, that's the sort of situation where people will ask questions, well, why not? Surely this is a major incident. Six people stabbed. Obviously, there's echoes of what happened in Reading. So, I think a good topic for a video will be precisely this: what is terrorism and what isn't? Um, Clearly, more will need to be known from the Glasgow incident. The police seem to be pretty quick to say it wasn't terror related. I think there's valid questions as to how the police reach conclusions ostensibly pretty fast. Perhaps one reason is public pressure. People want to know what's going on, people want to be reassured. Um, Clearly, it's a major incident, six people stabbed. Um, Even in a country that has a problem with knife crime, that is still pretty serious. Incredible there's been no fatalities. One of those hurt was a police officer, apparently. So, what is a terrorist incident versus a non-terrorist incident? Well, it's obvious that not every act of violence is described as terrorism, and I think it needs to be understood why. Because people often raise this question, well, why not? I think we need to look at that a bit deeper. Why, for example, is the numerous examples of spree shootings in the United States, why are they not considered terrorism? There is this conspiracy theory that goes around saying, oh, well, it's because the shooters are white. So it's the systemic racism. They're not called terrorists because the shooters are white. They must have mental problems or X, Y, and Z. Um, I think it's not as simple as that. And this is why. In many spray shootings that we look at in the United States, the motivation is often to do with workplace grudges and personal issues. Sometimes it's family disputes. Sometimes it's because the shooter has felt slighted. Um, Sometimes it's even relationship problems. We've seen this in a few examples in the Toronto van attack, for example, 2 years ago, or the case in, I think it was Florida a few years ago. In those cases, the attackers were motivated by a sense of impotency, that they were slighted by women. So one could argue it was misogynistic motivation. Um, but I've often seen this counter argument from some Muslims and some people of color saying, oh, well, there's hypocrisy because why are these cases not classed as terrorism? Well, you need to look at the motivation behind them. If a spray shooter opens fire on the workplace, there was that expression in the 2000s, going postal, so to speak. Actually came from the 1980s onwards. And the idea was a disgruntled employee would open fire on the workplace. I believe this actually goes back to the Edmund atrocity in Oklahoma, 1986, when um, an employee opened fire in the settlement of Edmond in Oklahoma. I believe that was workplace related, so hence it got this kind of, a lot of the spree shootings that followed in the United States were apparently disgruntled postal workers. Maybe there was something in that particular profession that brought out particular pressures or mental health problems. I don't know, but the expression "going postal" kind of became linked with that. Um, I'll give an example closer to home. In the UK, the West Cumbria shootings of 2010. Derek Bird, the gunman, opened fire, killed 12 people. Mass shootings are very rare in the United Kingdom because we have strict gun laws. So mercifully, they are very rare. But that was the last major example. Um, 12 people shot dead. So when we look at the profile of the attacker, Derek Bird, was his attack motivated by any sort of political goal? So, for example, was he lashing out at some sort of government policy? Was he trying to target the military? Was he trying to foment a race war? Was he an Islamist? None of those things. It turns out that Derek Bird, in all likelihood, had some sort of grievance with fellow taxi drivers. Um, and he snapped and he lashed out. Cumbria is a rural county, so therefore there's more access to firearms than there would be in big cities, because obviously farmers and so on need firearms to protect their livestock. Um, that's why the Cumbria mass shooting isn't classed as a terrorist incident, in the same way that, for example, the Westminster Bridge attack or the Manchester bombing is. Why? The Westminster Bridge attack and the Manchester bombing were motivated by an ideological agenda. They were less to do with personal slight, although that may have been a factor, but there was an ideological goal there, which in those cases was namely Islamic extremism, lashing out at infidel society, motivated by ISIS ideology. And then there was a counterattack at Finsbury Park Mosque, which was rightly labelled a far right incident because it was a kind of retorted attack, a retaliatory attack against Muslims. Still wrong, There's, I don't think we could sort of say, oh well, they got what they deserved because, I'm not going to buy into that sort of narrative, that sort of tribalism. Terrorism is terrorism. Um, that is very important to understand why certain attacks are labelled terrorist and others aren't. Another example, the Norway attack in 2011. Anders Breivik was motivated by an ultra white nationalist agenda. He wanted to lash out at what he saw as multicultural society. He was lashing out at Muslims, at left wing youth, and that was the worst far right atrocity in basically in post war Europe. The same applies to the Soho nail bomber in London, specifically because David Copeland wanted to start a race war by planting his nail bombs in London's black community and its gay community. Um, he was motivated by far right ideology. The London bombers in 2005 were motivated by Islamist ideology. Whatever way they justified it, that was their motivation. Whether it was retaliation for the Iraq War, whether it was anger at an infidel society, it was ideologically motivated. This is what needs to be understood. So there's many examples of atrocities that are not considered terrorist. And I think there's this mentality that people have, well, if it's not called terrorist, then it's somehow being trivialized. I don't think that's the case. I mean, the Las Vegas massacre was a completely horrendous atrocity, the worst mass shooting in modern American history. You know, 49 dead, hundreds wounded. It was an atrocity on a bigger scale than many terrorist attacks. But so far, there hasn't been any major indicator that the mass shooter Stephen Paddock was motivated by any particular ideological agenda, as far as I know. And if someone can correct me on this, I'll completely, accept that. As far as I know, he wasn't motivated by white supremacy or any particular explicit political goal. Now, in the case of the United States, people say white murderers are never labeled terrorists. That's not strictly true, actually. Consider Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bomber. He was a terrorist. He was widely called a terrorist, and he remains America's worst domestic terrorist. Until 9/11, it was the worst terrorist attack on American soil. No one's making excuses for Timothy McVeigh or saying, oh, he wasn't a terrorist. He was. And that's how it's described. Because he was motivated by a political agenda. He was motivated by hitting the federal government in the wake of the Waco siege. And he didn't care if he killed civilians. As far as he was concerned, it was justified. Um, so that's classed as terrorism because it was an ideological motivation. It wasn't like it was some sort of personal grudge against his wife or his colleagues or something like that. Which very often, I mean, in the case of spree shootings in schools, in school places, more often than not, we hear that the shooters were bullied. Now, it's not a justification, but there is a track record of that. It's often cited as one influence, i.e., they're bullied mercilessly, then they snap. And it's awful. It doesn't justify it. It doesn't justify just killing teachers and students who maybe had nothing to do with the bullying, but it's often one thing that's cited. So the Columbine massacre, for example, that was one of the major motivating factors. As far as I know, uh, I'm prepared to be corrected on this. Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold weren't motivated by white supremacy or anything like that because their victims were white and black. So, um, they were outsiders, it was this, they were purportedly bullied. It's no justification, but that's why that's not generally considered a terrorist attack. Now, the case of Dylan Roof, that can be legitimately called a terrorist attack because Dylan Roof was motivated by racial hatred. He targeted a black church, killed 9 worshippers, and he was a hardcore racist. So that's a terrorist incident. People need to understand this. I think people don't think this through. They just think, well, every atrocity is a terrorist attack. It's not actually. That's not to say that it isn't terror in terms of the purely adjective sense. Any act of violence is terror in the sense of that's what it is. But in strict terms, terrorism has to be ideologically motivated rather than a spontaneous act of violence. Um, it's important that people understand this. Of course, there's state terrorism as well. When we see, for example, the Tiananmen Square massacre or the Andijan massacre in Uzbekistan, um, or indeed the American firebombing of Vietnam and the use of Agent Orange, that could probably be considered state terrorism, um, where governments deliberately target civilians or at least really, really don't care about civilian casualties, then there is a strong argument there for state terrorism. So people need to understand this. And we see this every time there's an attack. People will say, oh, why is that not considered terrorist? Just because there's a stabbing in London and several people are wounded doesn't necessarily mean it is a terrorist incident. It may be a gang situation that's got out of control. It may genuinely be that someone has serious mental health problems. And this isn't to say that mental health problems are an excuse, but there are situations where it is irrefutably a factor. I think where an attacker shouts Allahu Akbar, common sense dictates that there may well be an Islamist motivation there, and there shouldn't be political correctness around that. However, it doesn't mean that every single act of violence which happens to involve a refugee is going to be terrorist in nature. That's not necessarily the case. So I assume this incident in Glasgow hasn't been called a terrorist attack because there's no obvious political motivation from the perpetrator. So I don't necessarily read a conspiracy theory into that. That may simply be the information the police have.